concluded that there were others that wrote the Torah. Well, that's a heretic. Moses wrote the Torah. Well, but no, that doesn't make sense, right? Plus you get all kinds of things. He was a very humble man. And usually humble men don't say that, although I love to point out that I'm always the most humble person in any group. I'm always the most humble. And in fact, I'm proud of it. I'm older today than I was yesterday. As somebody pointed out to me, and you can never be younger. In any case, there were other problems with it. Today, actually, we agree with Spinoza when you try to figure out, well, who actually wrote the Bible. There's lots of theories of, well, this author wrote this author wrote this author wrote that. There's lots of time periods. Clearly different people wrote different parts and so on. So there are a lot of things that he was critical of that got him kicked out of the synagogue. Either change your mind about this and say you believe this and join us, or you're out. And he said, I can't do that. And so he was kicked out of the synagogue, excommunicated. No communication. You can't even talk with this. If you see him walking down the street, you have to go to the other side of the street so you're not even close to him, right? He ended up then going to study with an ex-Jesuit who had a school and became a teacher with that ex-Jesuit in that school. That's almost like saying an ex-Marine. It doesn't make sense to me to say an ex-Jesuit. But in any case, that was the next step in his... And he became familiar with Descartes and Hobbes. And of course ended up being influenced by both of them. And of course, Galileo. So this new science, notice the way he writes the ethics is following the method that Descartes espoused, etc. So he ends up concluding that God is everything. And he's also convinced that every religious, every person that was coming up with religious ideas, things that became religious, were all essentially trying to do science. These are all scientists trying to figure out how to survive, how to live, how to cooperate with nature, interpreted as God, right? What does God want us to do? How do we stay healthy? How do we have healthy families? How do we survive in different kind of cataclysmic events? All those kinds of things. How do we understand all this? They're doing science. And so now that we have this scientific method, everybody's going to end up agreeing with one another in science. So all these religious conflicts, which, Europe was full of them at the time, right? All these religious conflicts are going to go away because everyone's going to basically convert to being a scientist. And we're all trying to do the same thing. So basically, not only is the entire universe God, but if you understand that and you believe that, that means that you're part of God, you're part of God, we're all part of God. And by harming one another, we're sinning against God. So we ought to love everyone. Not just those that we're, our favorites. But basically, if we're really going to understand God this way, what we need to do is accept everybody where they are, understand that they're going to, once we teach them what we know about science, we're all going to be thinking the same way. We're not going to have wars anymore, because we're all going to believe the same things. So science will transform us. We'll all believe the same things. Different religions will go away, etc. And so we end up with a series of ideas associated with how theology should affect politics, how the government, the state, we should have freedom of speech, and so on. I mean, because we're all trying to learn science. Freedom of speech is one of the best ways to do that, etc. And if you think about it, once he is kicked out of the synagogue, he changed his name to the Latin Baruch, or Benedictus, right? So Benedictus, I love thinking, though, if you find him confusing, remember his name is Holy Spinoza. Holy Spinoza. What the heck are you doing, right? Because that's his first name. By the way, I actually was a Republican until Obama was running for office, and when I saw his name was Barack Hussein Obama, I switched to Democrat so that I could vote, in the mess they had over at Bay Beach Middle School. I attended that. It was my first Democratic function, and it was almost a riot. It was, I thought, I switched to the wrong party. At least the Republicans, they would not have everybody all parked in this lot and all these new people coming in so that the people that are already there can't get out. You were there. It was just ridiculous. And it was, who of us are for Hillary? And I thought Hillary was wonderful, but it's Obama. Let's go for Obama. So I stood in the crowd that cheered for Obama, and so we voted for Obama. But I thought once he was elected president, the terrorists who were speaking Arabic would hesitate to attack the United States anymore, because after all, our leader was holy. Obviously it didn't work. That was my thinking though. But in any case, what happens when people become convinced of this? Now here's the problem. If you're an Orthodox, which means correct belief, Christian, you think of God as creating the universe. He's the creator. We are creatures, created beings, right? And that means that there's a distinction between the divine and everything else. So an Orthodox belief means you have to think of God as other. Pantheism, which is what he's giving us here, identifies God with the universe. So everything is God. Right? So you have to respect everything, everyone. And as a result, we ought to have an appreciation for people of other religions instead of wanting to kill them. Well, unfortunately, Spinoza's job, because he wasn't just a philosopher, the Jewish community believed everybody ought to have a job anyway, even though they study. I don't know how that still works out. But in any case, his job was grinding lenses, make glasses and telescopes and microscopes. And in grinding them, he created a lot of glass dust, and he inhaled this because he didn't realize that would be dangerous. And they didn't have masks, I guess, available anyway. So in any case, he died early from lung cancer. And in fact, his book, The Ethics, wasn't even published until later. He was afraid to have it published. He was actually invited to come and teach in Heidelberg, and he refused to go. So that's interesting. But remember, he spent 2 weeks with Leibniz, who read and argued with him about the ethics, and clearly was influenced by it, because there are a lot of people that criticize some of his metaphysical statements as being pantheistic or Spinozaist, which was, oh, don't become Spinozaist, you're a heretic then. Remember, that's very dangerous. You don't want to be a heretic. Hegel is also highly influenced by Spinoza, and a lot of, when you get into the description of things, you have to be very particular to make sure that you're not being a pantheist. And yet at the same time, they were all clearly impressed by a lot of things that Spinoza said. So you're accepting Spinoza, but you're trying to keep out of jail, right? Pretty much, right? And John Locke. When John Locke comes to visit, and I mentioned I want to get out of that. So John Locke, remember, he works for, I always forget his name, Lord Shaftesbury, thank you. Lord Shaftesbury. And while he's working for him, remember the concern with North Carolina, I don't know, both Carolinas, whatever, named in honor of King Charles. He's in charge of slaves, shipping slaves and so on. So he's clearly pro-slavery at that point. But once he goes, Lord Shaftesbury ends up in trouble. In fact, Shaftesbury ended up in jail for a while, and Locke fled to the Netherlands to be safe. And while there, became an assistant to William, who would eventually become King William. William and Mary, the Glorious Revolution, when William was invited because of Mary. Mary was really the heir that could take the throne and replace James. So he was a doctor and a counselor, and as he was working with them, he became familiar with the ethics. There, he had a copy that he could read, even though Spinoza had died from his illness. But so he becomes influenced by that, and we end up then with the idea of accepting other people's religions. We ought not to just, have these religious wars, which, remember, the Civil War in England was over religion. Do we want Catholics? No. Papists. Remember they tried to blow them up in the gunpowder incident, et cetera, in Parliament, and all that. Yeah. So there's all kinds of fights over religion. Well, the thing is, if the ethics of Spinoza is to be believed, and apparently it was very persuasive, and we were just reading the beginnings of it, but it continues on like that and argues for an ethical impact associated with everything being part of God, and all should be respected and so on. And if that's the case, then we shouldn't have these fights between religion, and that influences Locke. And so Locke is going to argue for cooperation among the different religions. But let's talk about how he understands things. John Locke is our second philosopher to talk about the social contract, and the more important one for us in our particular experiment, because it's his version of the experiment, or the idea of the social contract that the so-called founding fathers, that's what they're called. That's why I say so-called, not being critical of them, right?